Hi, this is Walt Cassidy coming to you from Central Brooklyn. Today's date is Tuesday, March 31st, 2020, and I'm going to be reading from my book, New York Club Kids by Waltpaper. I'd like to dedicate today's reading to the people of New York City. We've hit some really rough waters, and I just want to encourage everyone to hang in there and stick together. We'll definitely get through this. Today's chapter is the last chapter of the book, and it's called Mega Clubs. New York City nightlife exploded in a crescendo of creativity, success, and exuberance in the 90s before meeting its climax just prior to the new millennium. Peter Gatien had come to successfully reign over a veritable empire of high-traffic megaclubs. After the brilliant success of his flagship club, Limelight, he acquired and relaunched both Palladium and Tunnel and opened up Club USA in the heart of Times Square. With his pirate-like eye patch, worn to cover his missing eye from a hockey accident, he demurely tended to his portfolio of nighteries, while the press deemed him the club czar. I always admired Peter, even though we never worked that closely or became especially friendly. As his reach over nightlife expanded, it was easy to pigeonhole him into the role of a power and money-hungry Svengali. I never got that energy from him. He always struck me as the ultimate team player, which had to do with perhaps his background in hockey. His commitment to artists and creative expression was undeniable, especially when you look at the talent that he engaged with to create the interiors of his clubs and his support for not only the club kids, but also the rave, hip-hop, and rock scenes. He employed several iconic personalities who played key roles in the evolution of nightlife in New York. One such personality was Arthur Weinstein, who was probably the most frequently referenced personality in any conversation about the development of megaclubs. Certainly if you were talking to club owners, designers, and directors who worked behind the scenes in these places. He co-owned the influential club Hurrah, which was open from 1976 to 1980, in addition to a number of successful after-hours clubs, including Jefferson and Continental. Before Arthur came along, nightlife venues were predominantly black boxes. Weinstein, along with his wife Colleen, brought light and unexpected design elements into the spaces that they developed. Arthur had a contrarian spirit and seemed to enjoy challenging any status quo, whether it was in regard to lighting design, music, or social circles. Peter embraced Weinstein's talent and renegade spirit and employed him to oversee the lighting design for his clubs. Sophisticated lighting systems and mixtures of design elements were important for creating a mega effect for any space. A large part of Studio 54's emphatic appeal was in its theatrical lighting design, created by Jules Fisher and Paul Morantz. These interior standards were later carried over when Ian Schrager and Stephen Rubel enlisted Japanese architect Arata Isozaki to redesign Palladium for its 1985 conversion from concert hall to nightclub. At that time, there weren't many venues that utilized intelligent lighting systems, and the new Palladium was at the forefront. The venue was also known for bringing in artists like Keith Haring, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Kenny Scharf, and Francesco Clemente to enhance the interiors. The scale of Palladium was impressive, and there were so many dynamic elements within one nightclub. It was like a universe that held many planets, each one magical in its own way. The giant stairs were comprised of grids of circular floor lights. It felt like entering a spaceship when you ascended them. Everything was larger than life. Just when you thought you had a grasp on it, something would shift and change the whole experience in an instant. The main dance floor space was comprised completely of cubes and grids. Everything was a square within a square, which would make up an even larger square. The illuminated columns that lined the dance floor were crisscrossed to create a perfectly balanced architectural grid. There were 2 independent suspension racks, each with 25 square monitors that could be moved and animated while patrons danced below. My favorite lighting detail was a gridded palette that had a uniform field of tiny whirling spotlights. The techs would lower this palette down from the ceiling towards the dance floor, and it would come so close to your head that the lights would practically be spinning in front of your face. There was a particular song by Fantasia called Violet Skies from 1991, the opening line going, "I've come down from the violet skies to save the day." When the DJ played that song, they would drop the lighting unit as if the sky was coming down to greet you. You couldn't help but go completely nuts just from the combination of elements and the choreography of the lights and the music. The tech people working in these clubs were brilliant artists, Every little detail of the nightclub experience was curated to perfection. There was so much integrity in the mega clubs and in how people interacted with them. These forums commanded you to rise up and be your best in response to the many layers of inspiration that they offered. You were in the company of masters every night. The standards were so high that even if you were just going to dance and hang out as a civilian, the circumstances made you want to present yourself in the most interesting way possible. The simple physical experience of these spaces encouraged creativity, expression, and intelligence. One of my favorite areas to visit inside of Palladium was the engine room in the basement, designed by Michael Schmidt. The fact that it was so hidden away from the bustle of the main club added to its mystery and allure. When you entered the space, you felt as if you had discovered the deepest bowels of Metropolis or the Titanic. The central focus of the room was a mammoth industrial wheel which radiated a sense of power against the surrounding walls of exposed brick and concrete. The room's shadowy and stark aesthetic provided a great counterpoint to the rest of the club, which was generously bathed in colorful light. Maurice Brahms was another visionary club owner and promoter who created Infinity in 1975. The club predated Studio 54 and was a source of inspiration for Schrager and Rubel. Both Brahms and Arthur Weinstein were tangled up in a cocktail of camaraderie and competition with the Studio 54 team in the early days of the megaclubs. Brahms understood the profit value of a solid space and a cool crowd, and would continue to implement his rousing aesthetics in his later clubs, like Le Palace des Beautés at the north end of Union Square and Red Zone, which opened at 438 West 53rd Street. Red Zone catered to a diverse urban crowd of club kids and dance-infused teenagers who could often be seen gathering beneath the elaborate lighting rigs and the awe-inspiring battle circles to showcase their skills. Voguing balls would also be held in the space, so many of the prominent personalities from that scene held court too. This was the peak of Afrocentric hip-hop, acid house music, bubble toe shoes, and Gerbeau jeans. The influence of acid house could be seen in the club's op art-inspired advertisements and promotional materials, which were created by Gregory Holmes. Brahms' clubs were frequent targets of the city's Consumer Affairs Commissioner and local community boards who aggressively sought to close down the venues to ensure that surrounding real estate and tenancy favored quiet, family-friendly occupancy. Conflicts of this nature remain at the heart of the struggle between New York City's trademark urban street and nightlife culture and the whitewash gentrification initiatives pursued by many real estate developers and the city's government. Priority is too often given to these heteronormative agendas that insist on enforcing the sterilization of inconvenient creativity and expression in favor of neutered environments that are deemed safe for child rearing. It's a tendency that baffles people who gravitate towards urban hubs to escape the oppressive standards of control that embody the codes of suburbia. Unfortunately, money is what usually creates the upper hand, because street and nightlife culture is not often characterized by fiscal advantage. It tends to end up on the losing side. It was this kind of imbalance that would eventually lead to the destruction of spaces like Palladium, which clearly should have been deemed a historic landmark. Instead, the iconic Forum, which received extensive praise and acknowledgement within the architectural community, was demolished in 1998 by NYU to create a dorm. The last party to be held in Palladium was DJ Junior Vasquez's Arena. Kevin Aviance, whose presence was synonymous with Junior's parties, presided over the festivities. Aviance opened and led the final runway on the main dance floor to a packed crowd of shirtless muscle queens. To me, it was a fitting closure for the space. I first met Aviance at Palladium when we shared the King and Queen titles of the 1993 Style Summit. Peter Gatien, who was doing well financially with his megaclubs, was able to ward off many attacks by the vasectomizing Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, who settled into office in 1994. Gatien willingly adhered to the city's new ultra-conservative, unrealistic, and outdated codes and laws that Giuliani dug up to tool his quality of life campaign. Unfortunately, Gatien and all that his clubs represented were well under siege. After hammering his megaclubs with closure, the city failed to make any of their tarnishing accusations stick in court. When they did manage to pin Gatien for tax evasion, they ensured that his clubs would remain closed for good by forcing him out of the country. Years later, it was revealed that the FBI's main informant, Sean Kirkham, was in fact a disgruntled former employee of Club USA who accumulated an extensive history of hustling, conning, and scamming. He committed suicide before being summoned by Canada's courts for the last of his illegal stunts. Limelight was the central access from which all of Peter Gation's other clubs were created. While it had done fairly well in its early days, the club had not always been the exemplary space that it's now wistfully remembered as. In 1990, the venue went through an impressive transformation at the hands of Michael Alec, Stephen Lewis, Arthur and Colleen Weinstein, and Gregory Holmes. The same team was behind the world's ingenious rebranding and success in the late 80s. Limelight's most memorable hallmarks were implemented during this renovation. All of the interiors were redesigned, the go-go cages were hung from the ceiling, and an intricate programmable system of intelligent vari-lights was installed with the help of SCADA. Before the installation of these lights, the beautiful arching ceilings and other architectural details of the church space were hidden in the dark. This spectacular metamorphosis was bannered and promoted under the title Limelight Unveils. When Club USA first opened on December 17, 1992, it was the perfect representation of how downtown club culture had integrated into the mainstream. Area nightclub creator Eric Good was enlisted to oversee the art direction of the club's interiors, including a series of vitrines that were used to create the bars. These glass cases featured a library of gynecological instruments used in S&M practices and garnered fierce criticism from feminist activists. Fetish themes mixed with corporate and commercial iconography dominated the club, along with lounges designed by Jean-Paul Gaultier and Thierry Mugler. There were giant painted cutouts of dominatrixes carrying saws, and Spider-Man hung above the main dance floor beside a series of murals of circuit boards, a Japanese geisha, and a box of Kraft macaroni and cheese. Massive neon signs spelled out XXX and drugs, and a curling tube slide stretched down from the second floor mezzanine to the dance floor. Beside the main bar was an instant photo booth that could quickly generate strips of passport-sized photos. This was a mandatory stop while visiting the club, and everyone would repeatedly pile into the tiny picture box to enact a series of poses that more often than not included kissing, acting shocked, and sticking your tongue out in one fashion or another. The lounge designed by Jean-Paul Gaultier was on the second level and was fitted with two-seater rolling chairs and an assortment of furniture that was upholstered with patent vinyl and corset stitching. The front of the mezzanine, which held the Gaultier lounge, was covered in a wide array of advertising panels. The club had multiple floors that could be accessed by elevator. Jana operated the elevator, which was frequently referenced as the best place to hang out. It was entertaining to ride up and down with her and observe the different people who would travel between the floors. People like Nile Rodgers and David Lee Roth were said to take quite a liking to Jana. I met Timothy Leary in the elevator one night, and Juliette Lewis, while riding with William, marveled at his multiple lip piercings, curiously asking him how he kissed with all that hardware in his mouth. This was the era of the supermodel, so there was a strong fashion crowd present at Club USA. That contingent was most heavily concentrated on the main floor stage. I frequently saw Jay Davidson, Mickey O'Rourke, and his model girlfriend Carrie Otis. In the basement, Johnny Dynell and Chichi Valenti held court. The whole conceptual underpinnings of Club USA seemed to be diametrically opposed to the ethics of Jackie 60. It was pretty obvious that it must have been a money gig for them, as they maintained heavy criticism for the venue. Billy Beyond, Sister Dimension, and his wife Bubbles also hosted a party on those same nights. A number of old schoolers were hired at Club USA, as it was generally designed to cater to a slightly more mature crowd. Thierry Mugler's room was on the top floor, its design reminiscent of his photography work in terms of perspective and scale. The entryway contained a circular dance floor with tapering walls that stretched high above to a small opening which beamed with pulsating lights. This construction gave the effect of being trapped at the bottom of a well. After passing through, you were confronted with a sloping and rail-less staircase that ascended up to the DJ booth. With the footwear that everyone was wearing in those days, it's shocking that someone didn't die or at least get severely injured from falling down those stairs. Miraculously, I don't recall anyone taking the plunge. At the very back of the Mugler room was a pitch-black alcove with a velvet rope in front that served as a tiny corral for VIP guests to hold court, far removed from the sightline of other attendees. Like any dark, hidden corner in a nightclub, it offered an opportune spot to do drugs, unless, of course, Madonna was camped out in there. Michael Alec had become quite fond of the pharmaceutical drug Rohypnol. Nights at Club USA started off with him walking through the crowd distributing it to anyone interested. These pills tended to make me quite chatty and philosophical. After taking one, I could easily get sucked onto the couch outside of the elevator, engaging in long-winded conversations about the meaning of life and the inner workings of creativity. Time melted away, and it was not unusual to start a conversation at 11 p.m. and to think only 20 minutes had passed, and then be summoned downstairs to the office at 4:30 a.m. to be paid. The heavy drugs that we toyed with were well settled into our lives by the time Club USA opened. We still maintained a sense of humor about their impact, but they were already beginning to rot away at the underpinnings of our scene. I remember some of us club kids gathering in a stairwell at USA to do an interview with 60 Minutes in advance of the club's opening. The press piece was set to document a group of us as we prepared for the mega club's highly anticipated debut. The media was well informed and accepting of the club kids' playful use of non-threatening drugs like ecstasy, and I recall the interviewer jokingly asking us if we had planned to take the drug for the opening. We dryly responded that everyone on the scene was now into taking heroin. His face immediately dropped and the questioning skidded into silence. Michael nervously giggled, catching the reporter's shocked reaction. As Matthew and Zaldi passed by for a performance rehearsal, he proposed that perhaps the reporter should speak to them in an attempt to steer the interview into a more positive direction. We had all been contemplating what our look should be for the opening night of Club USA, knowing that the expectations were high. A group of us decided that instead of trying to compete with everyone else's over-the-top approach, it might be more shocking if we appeared to make no effort at all. We came up with the idea to have white t-shirts printed with our individual names on the front and pair them with standard issue Fruit of the Loom white briefs. By presenting ourselves as a kind of American athletic team, we were staying right on brand with the club's consumerist decor references. The idea proved to be effective, and photographer Tina Paul captured us right when we all piled through the front door's velvet rope. The gesture alienated a couple of the club kids who by sheer accident didn't know the plan. Despite the team effort, our group was not experiencing the unity that we once shared. Years of hanging out had passed. We were starting to mature and become more invested in our other careers and day jobs. Some people went back to school or moved away from New York altogether. The heavy street drugs turned off a good number of people. When I look back, I can see that this would have been the logical time to jump ship. In addition to using heroin and ketamine, some club kids started to freebase cocaine, smoke crack, and do speed. I tried speed a few times. It scared me and definitely wasn't a good fit. It made me feel like I was going to die, and not in a time-traveling way. I never smoked crack. That was a boundary that I was not willing to cross. I could see that the handful of people who picked up crack not only began to act mentally ill, but they also appeared dirty and unwashed like homeless people. Crack seemed to induce a high-density kind of crazy and a propensity towards vagrancy. Michael Alec was a prime example. When he started smoking crack, it was clearly the end of the road, and it created another fractured subset within the club kids. Genitalia and Carlin told me they freebased cocaine and smoked crack with Michael. They were my daughters. I didn't judge them, but I wasn't interested in going down that path. From that point on, they had a chemical bond to Michael. I didn't share that bond with them or with Michael. I suppose I was a hypocrite in allowing that split because some people had the same thoughts about me when I started shooting up. I'd convinced myself that my drug abuse was different because I was maintaining a somewhat normal bohemian lifestyle at the Chelsea Hotel. I had my drawing, painting, and modeling, and I also had a number of people in my life who didn't take drugs. I spent at least half of my days functioning completely sober and showed up for all of my work commitments. I was what you would call a functioning drug addict. I wasn't on the street pulling stunts to get my next fix. I fell into the caretaker role. The separation of chemical bonds would fracture and diffuse the power of the club kids for the last time as our group spiraled towards destruction and the end of the era of the mega club. The other chemical bond that emerged was with Peter Gatien. Within the club structure, Peter presented himself as a sober and grounded club owner. He never seemed to participate in any kind of partying, and this earned him a lot of respect. His physical presence, reliable constitution, and mental distance gave him power. Every once in a while, he would disappear from the club for about a week, as if on vacation. All the door people would whisper, like gossipy children, that Peter was in a hotel partying. I thought that humanized Peter. Maybe he wasn't really the god that I imagined him to be. When the details of his hotel parties began to leak through staff, my fantasy of him went through an unveiling as if in The Wizard of Oz he was just a man operating a machine. But even then, he was surrounded by mystery. No one could say for sure what he was up to. Michael started getting involved with these parties along with Genitalia, who began having an intimate relationship with Peter. This was when more details emerged. This was when the freebasing and crack came into the picture, because that's what they were doing at these hotel parties. While Peter appeared to be able to snap back into action as a sober club owner when these parties were over, Michael and Genitalia carried the experience back into their everyday lives. They began to unravel. I took up a job as Michael's assistant at Tunnel during the daytime. It was probably the worst decision that I could have made. When anyone with any sense was beginning to flee the scene, I did the opposite. Without people like Christopher Comp or Ernie Glam in the office, things got really disorganized. People would try to collect their pay at the end of the night and leave empty-handed because the budgets weren't done. The only way I could make sure that I got paid was if I took up the responsibilities in the office and did the budgets myself. Everyone knew that our scene was unraveling, and I snapped into damage control mode. I mistakenly thought that I could steer the Club Kid ship back to the days when the clubs were run professionally and creativity was thriving. Not only was I wrong, but I was now in the same exact position that I had been as a child, trying to use my creativity to put my broken family back together again. When I first arrived to the office, there were champagne buckets filled with urine on top of desks and piles of garbage everywhere. I went about cleaning and getting everything back to a functioning state. I kept strict and reliable hours and was always there to tend to any question or issue that might arise. I spent a lot of my time covering up for Michael, who was not showing up to work. The budgets were done properly and on time, and I organized staff meetings with all the club kids who worked at our parties to brainstorm and initiate some new ideas. They were confused with the formality at first, but they quickly became engaged and were happy to offer their ideas as to how we could improve the clubs. Because the Little Paper Gallery was going well, I tried to reignite some of the energy that had been behind the outlaw parties by starting a guerrilla group of artists called Blueprint. I engaged all the creative talent that I met or collaborated with over the years and established a steering committee which included people like photographer Misa Martin, Desi Monster, Anoni, Johanna Constantine, Genitalia, and designer Seth Shapiro. The group grew to include approximately 75 artists. Michael was excited by Blueprint because it was the first time since we began heavy drug use that we were being creative and constructive as a group again. We decided to stage an illegal art show in the subway station at Broadway and Prince Street in Soho. The artist would make a poster-sized piece that we'd take to the station and wheat paste over the advertisements. The idea garnered a lot of interest, and somehow our organizational flyer ended up in the hands of the police. When we swarmed the station, the cops were already prepared to bust the event, and we never got the chance to paste our artwork up. The gathering turned into a light protest on the street. In the heat of the moment, as a symbolic gesture, I draped my poster over the police car. The police were not amused. I was arrested and taken away, but I defiantly flashed my best Patty Hearst smile from the window of the police car. They put me in a cell, but released me when they saw that my record was completely clean. Blueprint continued to organize after that, but the energy that we created was not enough to avoid the much bigger problems waiting in the wings. Tunnel was a strange club. Even when it was completely full, it felt empty. I suppose part of that can be attributed to its architecture. It was an 80,000 square foot passageway, literally a tunnel, that used to be used as a railway freight terminal. When Peter Gasham purchased it in 1991, tripling its size, the space had been closed for 3 years since its first incarnation as a club. Along the main stretch, there were a series of small rooms with metal sliding doors on tracks. I assume these were the storage rooms for the space's previous incarnation as a terminal. Inside each room were different interior designs or installations. The most notable was the ball pit room, which was completely filled with plastic balls. The walls were made with reflective, bubble-shaped panels. People could play and bury themselves in a sea of these balls, just like a funhouse. Though the club was large, its most focused spot was the upstairs bathroom, which was covered in aqua teal tile and came complete with its own circular bar and sound system. William was the resident DJ there on Saturday nights. In addition to rows of bathroom stalls and urinals, there were couches and seating areas. It's appropriate that this room was the central focus within the club because the Club Kid nightlife experience had become almost exclusively about doing drugs. There was no need to leave the bathroom because we weren't doing anything else in the rest of the club. In the back of my mind, I had the oppressive, lingering sense that it was time for the Club Kids to close up shop and for me to move on to a new life, but I wasn't sure what my next move would be. I was a gaunt, eyebrowless queen who had invested every ounce of my energy into this lifestyle and vision that had initially offered many opportunities. We were well ahead of our time, and perhaps that was our curse. The days and nights seemed to get drearier and scarier with each passing second and every bit of gossip. We weren't dancing anymore. There were no new styles to pursue. There weren't even any new drugs to try. We had worked our way through the full decadent spectrum of everything. Michael's few scatterings of party ideas were completely lackluster. One was what he called the 10-year club. He thought it would be interesting to gather together all the personalities who had been working in nightclubs for 10 years or more. We ended up having a little spat over this one. When he presented the idea, I rolled my eyes and snipped. Who on earth would want to take credit for being stuck working in nightclubs for that long? I could see that this comment really hurt his feelings, but I could also see that he knew that I was right. We had painted ourselves into a corner, and we were too bombed out on drugs to find a clever way out of it, or even to just let the whole thing go. We reached a state in which nothing was shocking anymore. The well had run dry. For Michael, destruction became his only sense of control. Giuliani's Quality of Life campaign gathered steam by 1996. Peter Gatien was public enemy number one, and undercover police infiltrated the clubs. You could feel that our safe spaces were now littered with interlopers. It was a really strange feeling, almost Shakespearean. These misplaced, straight-looking white men appeared out of the blue, asking questions and staring at everyone. I remember waking up one day at the Chelsea Hotel to find 2 undercover cops in my apartment. I have no idea how they got in, but it seemed like they wanted everyone to know that the clubs were being invaded from every angle. They wanted us to be scared, probably in hopes of shaking out some kind of incriminating information. But there wasn't anything to reveal. I never knew about a manicured network of ecstasy production and distribution that was hidden behind the walls of the clubs, like the city officials and the press wanted everyone to believe. In any public party environment, whether it's a house party, a concert, festival, or a nightclub, there are people who want to do drugs. When you have people who want to do drugs, there's always going to be other people who feed that demand. Though thousands of people passed through Peter's clubs, the cops were only able to make a sprinkling of drug purchases. Considering the track record of informant Sean Kirkham, it's questionable as to whether those were even legitimate. Nonetheless, Peter made any changes that were necessary to the management of the club and door security in an effort to work with the city and crack down on any drugs or dealers that might be sneaking into his venues. Multiple raids by the police resulted in closures and fines. The press ran splashy stories about them to shape the public's perception of the megaclubs and justify the city government's aggressive behavior. When the venues reopened, they would cycle back through the whole process again. If they couldn't find anything concrete to nail Gatien, then they were going to try to destroy his businesses financially. At this point, Michael was completely surrounded by drug dealers. They lived in his apartment and were permanently attached to him. Peter Gatien tried to pull him away from them. I tried to pull him away from them. Many club kids tried. It never worked. Peter eventually called me into a meeting in his tunnel office with a couple of the main administrative promoters to brainstorm what could be done to help him. Peter offered to pay for Michael to go to rehab, but like any other addict, he found every excuse not to go. His main grievance was that he wanted to go to a brag-worthy celebrity rehab like Betty Ford, and Peter was too cheap to pay. That wasn't at all the case. In the meetings at Tunnel, Peter told me directly that he would pay any amount for Michael to go wherever he wanted, but Michael would have to go to the hospital first and begin the process of detoxing. We decided that I was the only person who could possibly convince him to do it. It felt like everything was riding on my back. Michael's health and well-being, the fate of Peter Gatien's nightclubs, and the future of the club kids all seemed to be my responsibility. I was still just 24 years old with my own addictions that needed tending to, but I knew that I was the only person that could get Michael into the hospital. I had been abandoned and disappointed by people my entire life, especially my own family. Being a part of the Club Kids was the one way I found full acceptance and semblance of a family that I never had. Though I should have just turned my back and walked away, I couldn't. I wasn't going to abandon the people who had believed in me. I went to Michael's apartment very early in the morning. As I expected, multiple drug dealers were there, and the space was permeated with fear. It wasn't Michael who was afraid. He was so numb from the drugs that he could barely get dressed. His hands were swollen to the size of baseball mitts, and he was covered in marks. The fear that I was confronted with was in the eyes of the drug dealers. I could see them asking themselves what would happen to them if he managed to get clean and stay sober. It was difficult for Michael to even walk, so I carried him to a taxi that took us to the hospital. We were early and we had to wait. Michael was shaking and convulsing from not having drugs. Even the other junkies felt bad for him, saying, "Your friend is in really bad shape. He looks really sick." The hospital could only accommodate a certain number of admissions. Hours passed and they announced that they were full for the day. I rushed to the desk with tears in my eyes and begged them to allow him into the program. I pleaded for them to just look at him. They could clearly see that he was in really bad shape. I lied and told them that he was my boyfriend and I was responsible for him, and they eventually agreed to take him. With Michael in the hospital, Peter had his apartment locked so that the drug dealers who were living there couldn't get in. He held the lease and paid for the rent for the apartment, so he had that authority. We all hoped that the detox would stick. When Michael returned clean, we thought the last thing he should be confronted with was an apartment full of drug dealers. We had turned a corner during those first 24 hours. Michael was safe in the hospital and beginning treatment. But before he could detox completely, the drug dealers found a way to get to him in the hospital, and they provoked him to leave. Rumors went around that Angel Melendez, one of the drug dealers who were tightly affixed to Michael, had been killed. I never saw any of the missing flyers or came face to face with his brother who was searching for him. Michael never told me that he killed Angel, and I never asked. I didn't trust anyone at that point. The clubs were filled with undercover cops, and the drug dealers would say or do anything to prevent Michael from getting clean. So I kept my mouth shut and my head down, just trying to deal with whatever obstacle came next. The last time I called Angel's beeper to get some Special K from him, Michael was the one who returned the call. He invited me over to the apartment where he had access to Angel's supply of drugs. When I arrived, I saw that he had painted the walls Russian red. Michael said there was no Special K, but suggested that we do some cocaine and go swimming in the building's pool. So we did, and we actually had a really nice time. Though he borrowed money from me all the time and saw me at work, Michael and I never really hung out alone. I didn't like the people he surrounded himself with, and I wasn't into the whole crack thing. I don't remember what we talked about while swimming. I just remember the experience feeling oddly normal and drama-free. This was many months before I checked him into the hospital to detox. The weekend after Michael left the hospital, we both showed up to work on Saturday night for the party that we hosted at Limelight. After working, we sat together in the stairwell, and he told me that Peter had given him an ultimatum. If he didn't clean up and go into rehab, Peter would fire him and ban him from the clubs. The rest of us club kids could remain employed, but Michael would not. The decision was now put on my back. Michael, Peter, and everyone else knew that I was the one holding what was left of the club kids and our parties together. If I decided to give up working for Peter and leave with Michael, all of the club kids would surely follow suit. If I stayed with Peter and Michael left, some of the club kids might follow him, but there was a good chance, especially with so many rumors floating around, that they'd choose to stay with Peter. Michael grabbed a bottle of champagne and suggested we take a taxi to Tunnel to speak to Peter face to face. I had Boob and the Little Paper Gallery, both of which were doing well. My life was still soaked in drugs, but I was surprisingly productive. While I was trying to manage and absorb all the chaos that was swirling around the clubs, I was intuitively chartering my way out of the whole mess. In the taxi, I told Michael that I wanted to do whatever he thought was best for me to do. I wasn't going to break the loyalty of our friendship. If he wanted me to leave Peter, I would. He said that Boob had the potential to turn into something really big. Peter had multiple venues, financial backing, and even a recording studio inside of Palladium. Michael thought it would be in my best interest to remain with Peter. If they couldn't resolve their conflict and come to an agreement that night, then I had Michael's blessing to continue working for him. When we arrived at Tunnel, Peter was at the front door. We all went inside the vestibule to talk. Peter had done everything he could and had offered every possible solution to help Michael. I knew this was true. I'd seen it for months. If Michael was not willing to get clean, he said, then there was nothing else to talk about. Michael would not accept those terms, so Peter invited me to come into the club and told Michael that he was not allowed in. I hesitantly went into the club with Peter and could see that he was shaken by the situation. He looked like a father who had just cut off his only son. As we walked into Tunnel, Michael threw the bottle of champagne at the wall near the entrance. Peter gave me a stack of drink tickets, and we agreed to meet in the office during the day and discuss what the next steps would be. We met alone, and he told me that he would like all of the club kids to continue working for him. I told him that I would stay if all the other club kids agreed to stay too. We called a second meeting with everyone. Peter and I explained the situation to the group, that Michael's every option was exhausted. I didn't respond to any questions about the gossip that had been going around about Angel's alleged death. In the little paper gallery, James St. James once looked at me and said, "I know you know what's going on." I just sat in silence. I actually didn't know. Michael never confessed anything to me. All I knew at that point was that I wanted to be out of that situation. I was tired of being the person who had to fix everything. I eventually made up my mind about what I believed when Michael and I took that taxi to Tunnel. I asked him if I should stay with Peter or leave with him to go work at another club. What I was really asking Michael was, did you do it? When he gave me his blessing to stay with Peter, I assumed that meant that he was guilty and that things were not going to end well for him. I knew he loved us all, and he would never want us to suffer because of his mistakes. I sensed that he was waiting to either die or be arrested. I guess we were all waiting for the same thing. Michael showed up midway through the group meeting, but was not allowed in. Everyone agreed that they would stay on with Peter and launch a new Wednesday night party at Limelight. If Michael started another party on a different night of the week, anyone who wanted to work with him was allowed to do so. We all put our best foot forward and tried to start anew. I was absolutely miserable. I never wanted to be in that position. I didn't aspire to be a head promoter in a nightclub. All I ever wanted was to have my artwork and creativity and find some type of sustainable success in life. Peter's clubs went through another cycle of raids and closings by the city, and the club kids did not return when they reopened. Gatian's mega clubs remained in that purgatory for a couple years. Michael was eventually arrested. Boob continued on for a few years before breaking up. The club kid audience would often regroup at our concerts. Rudolph Giuliani continued his assault on nightlife after Peter Gatian succumbed to his methodical attacks. Over the years of his tenure, he erased the remaining smaller and less powerful venues. Giuliani single-handedly destroyed the city's most cherished and distinctive industry, robbing thousands of creatives of sustainable job opportunities. He sent the city into a cultural coma that was compounded by the tragic 9/11 attacks. He used that tragedy to manipulate the devastated residents of New York and further implement his conservative policies. I struggled to make sense of everything that happened, as I imagine all of the club kids did. We went through the same challenges that any family faces when one of their own turns down onto a path of destruction. You ask yourself if you could have done anything differently, or if you somehow contributed or enabled that wrong turn. You wonder at what point, if ever, you surrender to the notion that the person you once knew and loved so well has become another person. You ask yourself which version of that person is real, or if both are real. After taking on the responsibility of gathering all the content for this book and trying to offer up a more accurate and insightful narrative than what has been previously issued, I decided that I didn't want to write a book about a fallen city, a murder, or destruction. To some extent, I'm still playing the role of caretaker in our club kid family, still trying to clean up the mess, still trying to bring the focus back to creativity. I hope I've been successful in offering that. I've carried around guilt over the years that I could fix neither my broken biological family nor the spiritual family that I found in the club kids. This book is essentially my breakup letter to my past. This is no longer my story. I'm releasing it to history where it belongs. Eventually, I confronted my own addiction by walking into a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, raising my hand, admitting that I was an addict, and asking for help. Through years of meetings and therapy, and with the help and guidance of other recovering addicts, I was able to unpack my own story and make peace with myself. Meditation became and remains my daily practice and foundation for wellness. While writing this book, I've wondered what kind of advice or wisdom I might be able to offer a young creative who is first arriving to New York City to pursue their dreams the way I did in 1991. I've wondered what advice I can offer my peers and people from my generation, those of us who were given the opportunity to survive. I learned from my years in recovery that presence is very important to well-being. I believe that anyone who is lucky enough to be able to move from childhood into adulthood will at some point be forced to look at their life's history. This examination can be brought on simply by age, or more forcefully by addiction, divorce, unemployment, tragedy, or an accident or loss of any kind. One of the beautiful but frightening aspects of adulthood is that we can make our own decisions about the energy that we surround ourselves with. In order to make clear and informed decisions, it's necessary to look at the past and unpack the experiences that have created pain and fear in our lives. It requires a tremendous amount of courage to view them through the lens of truth. Many people are unable to begin this process because they're afraid. I'm grateful that I took the time and the leap of faith to indulge in this task. It's something that I continually revisit and implement in my life as it evolves. As I take the time to look at my life, I'm able to see patterns, both good and bad. As humans, we're hardwired to seek the familiar and are constantly falling into reoccurring behaviors, often without awareness. Whether these patterns uplift or oppress us, we return to them. Once we can identify a pattern, we can choose whether or not to make those same decisions. It's through this process that I've learned to maintain some boundaries. I'm responsible for everything that is present in my life. We don't have the luxury of decision-making as children, but as adults we do. Something that serves us in one moment might not always serve us. Think of the old saying, what goes up must come down. When things come down, it's a good skill to learn how to get out of the way. There was a time when drugs opened me up to a new and inspiring perspective on life. The same is true of the club kid experience, but both changed directions at a certain point and became oppressive and destructive. When people, places, and things no longer serve your higher good and no longer infuse your life with happiness and positivity, it's okay to walk away. It's okay to walk away from your own family and your own friends. This dilemma can be confusing, but it's the ultimate justification to strive to remain present and observant within the context of your own life. Loyalty to dysfunction will never offer any rewards. Life can randomly issue unpleasant experiences. In those moments, I've learned to allow anger and sadness to wash through me, but only for so long. Just as it's important to keep boundaries with other people, I also keep boundaries with myself. Sometimes it takes longer for the water to run clear, but I try to be mindful of how much time I invest in pain. Afterwards, I eat, sleep, and commit to making new and informed decisions about whatever brought me to that place. I don't regret anything that I've experienced in my life. The only thing I regret is how much time I spent being dominated by circumstances that were completely within my control, but that I had convinced myself were not. Here are some other bits of random advice that I can offer to you as a New Yorker, an artist, and a survivor. Love your friends with all of your heart, but don't bank on them to save you when times are rough. Your best friend is more often than not your biggest competitor. When you need support, don't be surprised if your closest friends are the first to disappear. It's fantastic when that's not the case, but it happens more often than we're led to believe. That's not to say that you should not maintain and invest in those close friendships. Understand that you might be such good friends with someone because you guys share similar interests, and they might be vying for the same opportunities that you are. New York City is a highly competitive place. There were times when I achieved certain goals in my journey and turned to my friends that I had supported over the years. I expected them to be enthusiastic about my accomplishments, but was confronted with folded arms and a wellspring of shade. It was something they wanted for themselves. It's what I call the New York disease. While it's a reality, the motivating factors are a complete falsehood. There is enough room for everyone in this city, and there are plenty of gigs to go around. If you're coming to New York, expect this, so that you're not shocked or debilitated when it happens. Invite strangers into your life. Strangers are one of the many beautiful resources that New York offers. There is no shortage of them. In my experience, the strangers who found their way into my life have supported me the most. It's not wise to bank on being fabulous forever. It's wonderful to experience that feeling as you find your place in the city, and it can be a fantastic way to start, making an impressive splash on the scene. But you can count on fabulousness dissipating. It doesn't age well. Make sure you lay a solid foundation for yourself while your head is in the clouds. Learn your skills, set up your business, create your network, and position yourself to do whatever it is that you envision for your future. That window of fabulousness, when you are the most interesting person in the room, holding everyone's attention, closes faster than you can imagine. Make sure you have somewhere to land. A final bit of wisdom came to me when I was having a particularly rough time a few years ago. During one of my meditations, while feeling completely broken, I was confronted with my father's spirit, who frequently presents himself to console me and give me advice. He said, "Your creativity is your gift. It will get you over every obstacle in life. When you don't know what to do, turn to your creativity." The last really fun Club Kid party that I remember attending didn't take place inside one of the mega clubs. Right across the street from Tunnel was the Hudson River, which hadn't yet undergone development for the beautiful Hudson River Park that exists today. The river's edge was littered with broken piers and crumbling structures. At 27th Street, there was a distressed and abandoned concrete boathouse that a group of homeless people occupied. Michael Alec befriended the crew that lived there and offered them $200 to let us use it as an after-hours spot, which would come to be named Club ID. They not only agreed, but also engaged with the idea. In addition to buying themselves some crack, they dressed up the disintegrating space before everyone arrived by lining it with tea lights. The shelter was, believe it or not, quite charming in a post-apocalyptic sort of way. After Tunnel closed for the night, a large gang of us shuffled across the highway to the structure. The candlelit enclave led out onto large slabs of concrete that sat directly on top of the Hudson River. A group of us gathered together and sat in a tight cluster as the pewter-colored water passed in front of our platform shoes. Just like we had always done at the Club Kid houses, we shared whatever drugs were left, gossiped about the previous evening's activities, and dreamed about the future. I remember mentally acknowledging how nice it was that we were all together on such a beautiful morning. The nighttime had broken, and we cuddled closer together. As tattered and strung out as we might have been, and despite the unknown challenges that lay ahead, I understood that we were as much a part of the city as any of the surrounding buildings, or even the river that rushed before us. I knew that moments like these were fleeting. Our childhood would escape us, but the one thing that we could share forever was New York City.